I'm Dr. Josephina Price, here with Medical Care Driving Change's next edition of the Book Club. I'm here with Dr. Daria Wan, who is a sexual health and HIV specialist practicing in North London. So we welcome her for her new book, Unheard, Medical Practice of Silencing. So, if you could tell us a bit about your inspiration for this book.
I certainly will. Thank you so much for the invite to do this as well. It's really lovely to be here. So there were three things, which I'll try not to talk too much in length about, but the main things for me was one, an experience I had as a patient, which was over 10 years ago now. I was undergoing fertility treatment and having IVF because I have a very common menstrual condition, endometriosis. And during one of the cycles, I had terrible abdominal and pelvic pain, the worst pain of my life. And luckily for me, my husband realised I was in a lot of pain, took me to A&E, where they gave me strong painkillers and admitted me to the gynecology ward for further investigation. I was worried that I had ovarian torsion, which is an uncommon complication of IVF, which requires surgical resection. So I stayed in. I had an ultrasound scan, which thankfully showed that I didn't have ovarian torsion, but I was still feeling very unwell and in a lot of pain. And the medical team said to me they felt that the pain was due to the hormones from the IVF exacerbating my endometriosis and making me, feel so unwell and in so much pain. So I still needed to stay in for pain relief, and I required morphine. And it was when I was on the ward, I experienced something that patients sometimes talk about, which is their experience of being dismissed or disbelieved when I was on the ward. So I kept asking for pain relief, but I was denied it, and I was treated as if I was making my symptoms up, because I wanted to get more morphine. So, I was an unreliable narrator, someone who was falsely seeking morphine. And that was such a strange experience for me. First of all, I was in a lot of pain, but also it was my first time where I'd been a patient admitted to hospital, and I realised how vulnerable you can be in that situation. And luckily for me, I had help. My husband advocated for me and got me the pain relief that I needed, and I was able to leave hospital after 2 or 3 days. But I felt, when I went home, I felt really guilty and silenced. So at the time, I didn't complain myself to the team who, were treating me like a nuisance. And afterwards, I didn't complain either. I just wanted to forget about it. And I thought, well, if this can happen to me, if I feel like I've been effectively silenced, what happens to everyone else? I was at that point a new NHS consultant. I understood the system very well. I can speak English. I didn't have something life-threatening. But what happens to all those other women whose concerns are dismissed? Maybe some of them don't make it home. So that was the main reason for me, because I think often with patients, when they talk about not receiving the care they need, they're often told to speak up or shout for better care. But I realised in that situation that actually when you're at your most vulnerable, it's really hard to speak up. And we need to, in healthcare, be much better at listening. So that was the main reason, but a couple of other things. So I work in HIV medicine in East London, and I realised that, a lot of the people that I work with often go unheard when it comes to healthcare policy and research. So they're not often seen when we look at kind of policy documents. They don't often get focus when it comes to funding. And, again, they are trying to speak up, but no one's listening to them. And I guess the third reason for me was because I'm a doctor. I've been a doctor now for 20 years, and I still find it hard to listen sometimes, even with my best intentions. I know that I don't always listen to every patient as well as I want to. So I really wanted to explore in the book what makes it hard for us to listen as doctors as well.
Thank you for the very informed answer. It seems like it's a topic quite close to your heart and to your patients that you see regularly every day, being in the industry that you're in, with sexual health and HIV focus. So what is your overall message that you would like to convey to medical professionals, having read your book?
So I think one is the importance of listening, but not just listening to patients, believing them as well, and understanding that the systems that we work in, the way we're trained, often makes it hard for us to listen and believe all patients equally. So really thinking about how we can do that as individuals and in institutions and in policy. And also thinking about how we can really amplify patient voice. So in medicine, there is a lot of hierarchy, and often, doctors are at the top, and then you have allied healthcare professionals, and patients are often at the bottom. So in the book, I really wanted to talk about whose knowledge do we value when it comes to medical expertise. So really rebalancing that power imbalance. So yes, we as doctors have medical expertise that we have through practice and education, recognising that the allied health professionals have other knowledge which is complementary to ours and just as valuable, and that patients have lived and learned experience. They know their bodies best, and really recognising that their knowledge of their bodies and their conditions is equal to ours. And by listening to each other, working together, we can really rebalance those power hierarchies so that everyone is listened to and have better health outcomes for all, and also improve health equity.
So we talk about health, you talk about health equity quite often in your book, and you also reference about the hierarchy nature of medicine, specifically in the UK and in Western medicine. If we could delve into where you think the patriarchal nature and hierarchical nature of Western medicine has evolved and how that impacts patients today.
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to if we look at the history of medicine in the West, traditionally doctors have been male, they've been upper class, they've been white. So they're who we traditionally think of who doctors and physicians as being, and they've held all the privilege and power. And because of that, they have, really affected how we see medicine today. They've built medicine, essentially, and in their own reflection. So when we think about who's not listened to in medicine and who is at the end of health inequalities, it's often people who aren't middle class or upper class white men. It's people who haven't been thought about or listened to in medicine before. So recently we've seen now we have more female doctors than male doctors. That's a new thing, and because we are seeing more women in medicine, it means that conditions that predominantly affect women have received more focus. So now we're seeing more research on conditions that affect women and more better health outcomes, and that's the same for other marginalised groups as well. We've got more people of colour in the medical workforce, which means that conditions that predominantly affect people of colour are now being addressed. And a good example of this is sickle cell disease, where we've previously had very little research or policy focus, and now we're seeing advances. So that history of medicine is changing, and it means that we have a medicine and a healthcare system that is better designed for all populations, which makes it more equal, and that's really important for patient care.
So obviously there's a historical context when it comes to understanding where health inequalities have come from. With the book, you reference about your own experience as a patient, and you alluded to it before. If you don't mind me asking a bit more in depth about your experience as a patient and how it's influenced you as a doctor now listening to your patients.
Yeah, so I think I really reflected on why wasn't I listened to, and I think it's probably because, I'm a woman, and probably because I'm a woman of colour. And when we look at health inequalities, when we look at patient safety reports, we often see women of colour, face big disparities in their health outcomes. And I'll give you an example for South Asian women. There was a review into maternity at a hospital, and it was found that midwives described South Asian women as being princesses. So women who were overly anxious, making up their symptoms a little bit. So that was a stereotype about being a South Asian woman. I think that's one of the reasons that I wasn't listened to, because of stereotypes about South Asian women. And in terms of how it's affected me, certainly it's affected my practice as a doctor. So I work on the wards with HIV patients, and I think I'm much better at thinking about pain and making sure that's addressed. And when I wrote the book, actually half of it I wrote when I was out of clinical practice doing a master's, and I came back to clinical practice and I thought, I'm going to be such a good listener. So in my consultations, I made a real effort to make sure patients felt heard, and after about 2 months or so I realised this is really hard actually. The systems we work in aren't built for this. To
promote active listening and empathy.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't have supervisions. We can't really, it's hard to debrief when you've had an uncomfortable conversation and you're not exactly sure why that's happened. So that made me think about, how can we listen in a pragmatic way? What are things that we can do practically to improve things? But I do, it has changed my practice. I think I'm much better at making sure the patient feels heard, even if I don't necessarily agree with them, I think I'm more able to spend the time to explain why I don't agree with them and to offer them, you know, a second opinion or reading material or another appointment potentially to discuss, you know, our disagreements and hopefully come to a practical solution that works for us together.
You make reference into the book about recommendations on how doctors can engage in active listening. So if you could come up with a few suggestions for how clinicians can better develop empathy and show more active listening to their patients, what would you recommend?
So I suggest things at different levels. So for individuals, it's really about reflecting on your own practice. So thinking about, you know, consultations which have been uncomfortable or difficult, trying to really think, you know, what happened there, and also reflecting on, you know, when do you find it hard to listen? So for me, I, you know, will do a clinic and then mid-morning, I know that I'm hungry and I find it really hard to listen when I'm hungry. So, you know, I'll eat a banana, I'll pop to the loo, and that little tiny break means I'm much better for the second half of my clinic. So really thinking, you know, what makes it hard for you to listen? What would make listening better? I think are useful things for us to do. But I think there's lots of solutions that can be kind of institutional as well. So thinking within our departments, where are there opportunities to debrief? Can we fit in clinical supervision more regularly so you can have these conversations? I think, you know, are there spaces that are private? So you've got, for example, a space on the ward where you can have those conversations with patients and their relatives. We often don't have time in medicine, but can we perhaps get the patient back for another appointment if we need to have a conversation that, you know, that's going to take a few sessions to really get to the bottom of? And I think one thing that we're losing at the moment in medicine is continuity of care, and that's incredibly important because in terms of building that doctor-patient relationship, that's something that is built up over time, but it's so productive when it happens. You know, you have safer patient outcomes, you're not starting again from scratch, you trust each other, you know how each other communicates. So thinking about how can we make sure continuity of care is more prioritised. I think, you know, in modern healthcare, we don't really think of listening as being productive. So, you know, we think about things like number of patients seen, number of tests done, diagnoses, treatments made.
Very empirical stats.
Yeah. But actually, listening in itself can be therapeutic, which I don't think we sometimes really realise. So, you know, it's not uncommon for us to have patients where we're not sure what's going on, or it's something that we can't actually fix for them. So if they have a chronic condition, that there's not much we can do. And I think that makes us as doctors very uncomfortable when we can't fix somebody. And that's often a scenario where we might shut them down or silence them. So if we realise that if you let someone speak and tell them your worries, we're bearing witness to their suffering essentially. And that in itself can be therapeutic. They can leave the consultation feeling better. So maybe that is actually a productive thing as well. So, you know, having kind of more incentives to listen better, so more patient-reported outcomes, for example.
If you'd like to give a take-home message to the medical community about your book and about how best to empower patients, but also change our workspace to encourage us more to listen further, what would you say?
So Unheard is a book about who gets listened to and who doesn't in medicine, and whose knowledge we value and whose knowledge we don't value, and how if we listen to each other better and reduce power imbalances and hierarchies, we'll achieve health equity. And it's meant to be a positive book. It's not about blaming doctors for poor care. It's about how we can individually and institutionally really change practices and work together with patients to really improve health outcomes, and not just for minoritized groups, but for everyone.
Thank you very much for your time. So you can catch Dr. Dario One's book, Unheard, The Medical Practice of Silencing, in major stores as a hardback form, an ebook on Amazon, and also as an audiobook. So I'd like to thank the Royal College of Physicians for Medical Care Driving Change Book Club. Thank you very much for joining us.